Viewers like you make this program possible. Support your local PBS station.
It was, as one newspaper noted, a diabolical act, unparalleled in the annals of terrorism. On September 16, 1920, as the bells of Trinity Church tolled and hundreds of Wall Street workers headed out for their noontime break, an explosion struck outside the headquarters of J.P. Morgan & Company, the world's most powerful banking institution.
The bomb broke windows, it knocked trolley cars off their tracks 2 blocks away. It ignited curtains 12 stories in the air. It was just a savage, horrifying thing.
People fled their places of work, and they saw basically a war zone.
This was an attack on civilians, just for the sole purpose of creating terror.
The blast left 38 dead and hundreds more injured. Striking at the heart of the nation's financial center, many wondered if this was the spectacular blow against capitalism that radical agitators had so long discussed.
The corner of Wall and Broad Streets represented the fusion of American capitalism with American government. You could target them both at once.
The targeted is to say we are taking on the citadel of American capitalism. We loathe it, we want to overthrow it.
Financial centers around the country went on high alert. The head of the Morgan Bank sent guards to his family's Madison Avenue residence. As federal troops arrived to protect the nearby U.S. Sub-Treasury building, investigators sifted through the rubble for clues.
It's not at all clear who might be responsible. So many people out there had a grudge against Wall Street that people wondered, well, it could be any one of these forces, which of course increases the anxiety even more.
Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer arrived on the scene and told reporters the explosion on Wall Street was the terrorist attack he had warned Americans about. For more than a year, in the tumultuous aftermath of World War I, he had been at the center of a bitter national debate about how far the government should go to protect the nation from acts of political violence. Palmer pointed to the carnage on Wall Street as proof of the need to renew aggressive action.
It's easy to think about terrorism as this frightening plague of the early 21st century. The Wall Street bombing suggests it actually has a much longer and deeper history. How widespread government surveillance ought to be, what kinds of policies are justified in containing a threat. Those questions were being openly asked in 1920.
In January 1919, ships carrying thousands of soldiers home from World War I sailed into New York Harbor. Filled with hopes for a better future, the troops were greeted by cheering crowds, eager to leave behind the horrors of a brutal war that had left 16 million dead. Returning soldiers had reason to feel optimistic about the economic opportunities ahead. Corporate profits had tripled and stock prices had boomed during the war, helping to create 42,000 new millionaires.
World War I really was a watershed moment in terms of the American economy. The United States, for the first time, is a creditor nation, so Europe owes the United States more money than the United States owes to Europe. This is a big coming-of-age moment.
Profitable though it proved to be, the war also created economic and political divisions that threatened to derail dreams of post-war peace and prosperity.
While the American economy in general benefited from the war, the chief beneficiary was the financial establishment centered in New York.
There was some pent-up frustration about the fortunes that had been accumulated during the war. There was the sense that it was a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. There was also the bitter legacy of the repression that occurred under the Sedition Act and the Espionage Act.
Shortly after American entry into World War I, President Wilson had signed espionage and sedition laws, which made it a federal crime to speak out against the government or the war. The legislation was an unprecedented regulation of free speech that sent thousands to jail and fostered an atmosphere of suspicion.
Americans were schooled throughout the entire war in being afraid of things, in being afraid of foreigners, in being afraid of German spies, in being afraid of anyone who wasn't sort of like the majority, which was essentially white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant.
The president spoke against hyphenated Americans. You shouldn't call yourself German Americans or any other type of hyphenated Americans. The war really ratcheted up that sense of American patriotism, jingoism, if you want to call it that.
By early 1919, Americans conditioned to fear Germans were focusing their anxieties on a new global threat: Vladimir Lenin and the Bolshevik revolutionaries, who had seized power in Russia to form a communist state.
The Bolshevik Revolution was the world's first successful anti-capitalist revolution in which it appeared that the working class had risen up and overthrown its masters and put something very, very different in its place.
It was much bigger than something that happened in Russia. It was followed by a series of left-wing uprisings right after World War I in Germany, in Hungary, in Italy, in Argentina, in other countries around the world. For that moment in 1919, the world was really in play. These countries were in play.
Lenin comes out and says, we want the workers to take over the world. And you begin to see glimmers of this happening in the United States.
On February 5, 1919, Seattle Mayor Ole Hansen sent an urgent message to the U.S. Secretary of War. The entire city of Seattle was about to be shut down in the first general labor strike in U.S. history. The strike began 2 weeks earlier. 35,000 shipyard workers had walked off the job demanding higher wages to cope with rising living costs.
From the point of view of workers, this was their time. They had sacrificed so much for the war, including their wages, and they had seen their employers gain when they fell behind.
In an unprecedented show of solidarity, 25,000 workers from other unions joined the walkout.
The entire city was shut down for a few days. The trolleys did not run, other industries did not show up to work, etc. And of course, this really alarmed the powers that be.
It raised a specter of what organized labor could accomplish, and it was scary to a lot of people.
In the weeks leading up to the strike, pamphlets about the Russian Revolution circulated widely among Seattle's workers. "The Russians have shown you the way out," they read. "What are you going to do about it?" The strike was peaceful and orderly, but Mayor Hansen viewed it as the opening shot in an attempted communist revolution. Seattle's residents braced for civil war, while a local newspaper blamed the riffraff of Europe among the workers for starting it. Hansen threatened martial law, then summoned federal troops to end the strike less than a week after it began. "The time has come," he said, "for the people in Seattle to show their Americanism." Hansen became a minor celebrity for his strong stand. He soon embarked on a lucrative national speaking tour to warn of the foreign agitators threatening the nation. His speeches stoked fear among those already unsettled by the strikes rippling across the country. Almost 4 million men and women would join the picket line in the coming year, an average of over 200 strikes a month, threatening to shut down the nation's vital industries.
You see a really wide range of demands, and you also see a new kind of revolutionary language taking hold.
Workers were questioning the validity of private ownership of industry. Let's let the government keep running the railroads. Let's nationalize the mines. And it really frightens people in the context of believing that somebody might be manipulating them.
In the wake of the Seattle strike, Congress opened hearings on the communist threat. They debated laws banning immigration and revolutionary speech, and then waited to see if the Justice Department would act. The new Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, didn't want mounting hysteria about the red threat to set his course at the Justice Department. The former Pennsylvania congressman was more interested in promoting the progressive ideals on which he'd built his political career.
He was a Democrat on the liberal fringe of the party. When he was in Congress, he introduced legislation to give women the right to vote, to end child labor, to support labor unions. Wilson appointed him Attorney General, not to impose any kind of crackdown against radicals, but because he would be helpful in defusing the tensions that existed during the war.
Some of the president's closest advisors dismissed Palmer as a political opportunist with an eye on the Oval Office. Wilson considered him a loyal ally. In his first term, he offered Palmer the job of Secretary of War. Palmer turned him down, claiming it would violate his religious principles as a Quaker. He later served the war effort by overseeing the seizure and sale of German-owned assets in America.
He had a very good talent for making headlines. It threw him in the limelight, and by the end of the war, he was a real celebrity.
He acquired a nickname, the Fighting Quaker, because he was fighting on behalf of America, and that was sort of how he was known at the moment that he became Attorney General.
In his first weeks on the job, Palmer signaled a shift from the repressive wartime policies of his predecessor.
Some of the first things he did were to free about 50 people who had been jailed under the Espionage Act. He disbanded the American Protective League, which was a vigilante group created during the war to crack down on slackers and spies. So everything had him acting as a moderating influence.
Investigators were impressed by the bomb's cunning design. A wooden tube filled with an acid detonator and dynamite. Concealed in a gift box, the bomb arrived at the office of Seattle Mayor Ole Hansen in late April 1919. An aide to Hansen opened the package, but it failed to detonate. An identical box delivered to the Georgia home of a former U.S. senator blew off the hands of the maid who opened it. In the coming days, federal investigators would discover 28 more bombs, making their way through the U.S. mail, all timed to arrive on May Day, the International Day of Solidarity for radical political groups. The intended recipients included 6 congressmen, 3 cabinet members, Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, and the nation's preeminent banker, J.P. Morgan Jr.
The targets were very, very prominent capitalists and others who had specifically targeted radicals. It was a sinister and very well-planned plot.
One of the packages was addressed to Attorney General A. Mitchell Palmer.
This is an enormous scare, and people begin to think, is there an organized conspiracy for revolution in the United States, and are there more bombs on the way?
It gave the impression to the country that the radical fringe was escalating the violence to an unacceptable level.
Although most of the bombs never reached their destination, newspapers urged Americans to call police before opening any suspicious packages. Citizens already on edge lashed out. Riots erupted when mobs attacked May Day rallies in cities across the country. Ole Hansen went on the offensive, criticizing Palmer for his weak response to the threat at hand. "I hope Washington will buck up and hang or incarcerate for life all the anarchists in the country," Hansen told crowds. Palmer held firm. He pledged he would treat the mail bombs as a criminal investigation and no more. He ordered the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation to draw up a list of suspects, then left the case in the hands of the post office inspectors. Palmer wouldn't be able to remain on the sidelines for long.
We tend to think of the late 19th and early 20th century as being a kind of triumphal age in which the United States grows richer. But what's also emerging during this period are whole new sets of ideas about what's wrong with capitalism. Some of that came out of the organized labor movement. Some of it came even further to the left, groups like anarchists and socialists, who really did think that capitalism needed to be overthrown, done away with altogether.
People were deeply anti-capitalist because it had destroyed lives of all kinds. Capitalism is a kind of curse, and the people, therefore, who run it are seen as bestial, as depraved, as inhuman, as consummately greedy.
Since the early 1900s, labor and revolutionary groups had argued about how best to challenge the economic inequities of capitalism. Whether change would come through votes or violence.
There's a huge range of opinion about whether revolution is going to be something that comes in people's hearts and minds, or whether you're literally talking about an armed uprising. You see lots of people saying what democracy means is that you can run candidates for office. That is how you make change. And then you have a small number of people who say terrorism is a useful tool in this whole story.
Anarchists had been among the first to advocate dramatic acts of violence as a political weapon.
Anarchism had many different branches. Again, there were the pacifists, there were the syndicalists, there were others, and among them were a group of people who believed in what was called the propaganda of the deed, and the deed was violence.
One of the most prominent proponents of propaganda by deed was a charismatic Italian anarchist named Luigi Galliani. His followers numbered in the thousands, the vast majority of them immigrant manual laborers.
He was amazingly eloquent, and he spoke to groups of people in gatherings in labor groups and Italian enclaves all throughout the East Coast. And he wrote books as well. One of his books was called La Salute è in voi, which in Italian means the health is within you, which sounds like a nice, peaceful thing. It's actually a dynamiting manual, and how to use dynamite effectively.
For more than a decade, Galliani had published an Italian-language weekly called Cronaca Sovversiva, Subversive Chronicle, which attacked the state and private property owners. Galliani's feelings about the government were clear. Overthrow it, he wrote. Make the country free forever, with the triumph of true democracy made by Americans, not by Wall Street.
It was a truly incendiary rag. The Bureau of Investigation discovered this publication during World War I and quickly put it on the banned list of periodicals. The Bureau confiscated lists of subscribers and immediately targeted all of them as radicals to be watched.
Bureau agents also raided Galliani's home, gathering evidence that immigration authorities would use to deport him in June 1919. As he prepared to leave the country, Galliani urged his followers to seek revenge against the tyrannical federal government. Shortly after 11 p.m. on June 2nd, just a month after the May Day plot, police arriving at the Washington, D.C. home of A. Mitchell Palmer encountered a disturbing scene. A bomb had exploded on the Attorney General's doorstep, detonating prematurely as the bomber was delivering the device.
It was really just a huge, mind-ripping explosion. They saw the remains of this man blown all over the neighborhood. There were pieces of limbs and blood on the trees. It was just a shocking violation.
A few minutes earlier, he and his wife had been sitting in the library downstairs. If they had waited a few minutes longer before going upstairs, they would have been dead.
Palmer soon learned of midnight bombings in 6 other cities, most at homes of anti-radical judges and legislators.
Unlike the May Day bombs, which conceivably could have all been put together and mailed by a single person, it's quite clear that there's no single person who could have set off bombs in Washington and Boston and New York and several other cities at the same time. So it's clear that there is some sort of organized conspiracy.
Found among the wreckage of Palmer's home was a flyer promising more violence.
The flyer was a masterpiece of rage and eloquent militance. It brooked no uncertainty at all about what was coming. There will have to be murder, we will kill. It said the powers that be had provoked this. It ended with long live the revolution, and it was signed anarchist fighters.
You can imagine, it terrified Palmer, and in some sense, it actually radicalized him on the question of what are we going to do about people who are advocating revolution in the United States.
The evidence scattered across Palmer's lawn pointed to Galliani's followers. But Palmer didn't limit his next move to hunting down the bombers. He used the June attack to launch a broader campaign against all revolutionary organizations. Warning the next attack could come within weeks, Palmer told Congress what he needed to prevent it: emergency funding to investigate and deport what he described as the alien troublemakers threatening to overthrow the government.
What they decided to do was not to wait for another violent outbreak, but to launch something of a preemptive strike, to try to get as many radicals as they could off the streets, and to the extent they could, out of the country.
Palmer created a new domestic intelligence unit to keep tabs on potential threats. It was called the Radical Division.
This was a transformative moment. You had never had the federal government coming forth in quite such a concerted way to say, we're going to keep track of political movements, political groups, radical organizations within the United States during time of peace because they actually pose a threat to the national order.
Palmer's choice to run the new unit was an ambitious 24-year-old Justice Department lawyer named J. Edgar Hoover.
He was a bright young man who stuck to the rules, much committed to Protestantism, and he was very good at organizing. Hoover read everything he could get his hands on the communists and became firmly convinced that they were the greatest threat that existed.
Hoover had put himself through law school by working as a clerk at the Library of Congress, mastering its complex classification system. He began his legal career identifying politically suspect foreigners during World War I.
He takes what he's learned at the Library of Congress, he takes what he learned processing Germans during the war, and he sets up what is effectively the first really mass peacetime political surveillance filing system in the United States.
Hoover built his database from a vast array of sources, including military intelligence, postmasters, and private detectives. He hired translators to monitor radical publications and planted undercover informants inside labor unions.
He was setting up a system to keep track, literally, of every identified radical in the country, who they talked to, where they lived, what organizations they belonged to.
You didn't need very much to become a target of the Bureau of Investigation. All you had to do was show up in the orbit of some kind of radical or labor demonstration, or criticize the Justice Department.
In its first year of operation, the division would amass more than 200,000 files on radical activities. The Justice Department's efforts did little to ease the fears of Americans who saw revolution in the labor unrest sweeping the country. In September, just weeks after the formation of the first American Communist parties, steel workers nationwide walked off the job. Coal and railway workers also threatened to shut down. The walkout of 3/4 of the police department in Boston threw the city into chaos.
They were branded as Bolsheviks, because it was inconceivable that they could have done this on their own.
Everything feeds this kind of atmosphere of hysteria, that agitators, red agitators, are stirring up people to engage in this kind of social disorder, this kind of violent behavior. So people feel they're living on the edge.
As letters calling for government action flooded Congress, senators demanded Palmer explain why he had not yet taken action against those attempting to bring about the forcible overthrow of the government. On November 7, 1919, Palmer silenced his critics. He launched a raid on the second anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution to send a message that America was fighting back against communist influence. With Hoover serving as the point man in Washington, agents arrested several hundred members of a group he had been monitoring, the Union of Russian Workers.
It was a quite violent affair, designed as much for political effect and for theater, as well as actual breaking up of these radical organizations. The government was now actively cracking down on radicals. I mean, they wanted that message out there.
Hoover commandeered an army transport ship to carry 249 detainees back to Russia. In a headline-grabbing move, he included two of the nation's most notorious anarchists, Emma Goldman and Alexander Berkman. Their celebrity overshadowed the fact that most of the detainees had never been part of a criminal or terrorist plot.
You could call it a publicity stunt, but it was a very major action. They sent the Russians back where they belong. That's how it was portrayed.
The Palmer raids, for all their terror, were really cathartic in the sense that it sort of made most Americans think, well, we've handled those people, and we're not going to hear much from them anymore.
As the deportees left New York Harbor on December 21st, reporters claimed their shouts of "Long live the revolution in America" could be heard on shore. Newspapers celebrated Palmer for taking action.
Palmer was viewed as a strong leader who, in the midst of chaos, was drawing a firm line. He recognized this as a boom, and he very shortly would start organizing a campaign for president of the United States.
Promising no let-up, the Attorney General authorized Hoover to move forward with plans for a massive raid just after the new year. On the night of January 2nd, 1920, Palmer's agents struck simultaneously in 33 cities across the country. Raiding parties swept through meeting halls and private homes, arresting everyone in sight. They seized nearly 5,000 people for deportation. Many were American citizens and didn't belong to any of the targeted radical groups.
Hoover was receiving telegrams and phone calls and messages by the hundreds. Every time there was a legal question, a logistical problem, it would first go to Hoover.
Hoover pretty much ran what are now called the Palmer raids, but might easily be called the Hoover raids.
With support from local police, federal agents herded suspected radicals into detention centers, searched their homes, and confiscated their possessions.
Thousands of people were detained without any warrant, without any specific cause. They were kept for weeks at a time. Some were beaten.
They had no prisons big enough to hold all of these people. In Detroit, they put about 700 or 800 people in a corridor of a government office building with one bathroom, a water fountain, and held them there for 7 or 8 days because they had no place else to put them. In Boston, the person committed suicide because the conditions were so bad.
It sent a real terrifying message through the immigrant community. And I think for the anarchists in particular, this was the final evidence that the American government had declared war on their people.
Soon, it wasn't just radicals who thought Palmer had gone too far.
The evidence started coming out about just how thin these cases were. The fact that very few of these people had any connection with violence or real radicalism, a real threat to the country.
Church, labor, and business groups began questioning Palmer's tactics, which had failed to produce the May and June bombers or evidence of a future plot. Even within Palmer's own Justice Department, there was criticism. On January 12th, U.S. Attorney Francis Fisher Kane resigned from office in protest. "We appear to be attempting to repress a political party," he wrote to Palmer. "By such methods, we shall drive underground and make dangerous what was not dangerous before."
You've taken people whose opinions you don't like, who have joined organizations that you don't like, and you've arrested them en masse without ever having a court proceeding. Are these people really a threat, or are they not a threat, and how are we going to assess that? You get a really big set of questions about what kind of country do we actually want to be.
In the coming months, Palmer's critics gained momentum. The acting Secretary of Labor nullified more than 2,000 deportation warrants, calling the evidence against the deportees flimsy. Palmer tried to focus public attention back on the Red Threat, claiming that he had received intelligence warning of a revolutionary upheaval on May 1st. When the day passed peacefully, Palmer was ridiculed for being an alarmist. A month later, a damning report by 12 prominent lawyers accused the Attorney General of utterly illegal acts which have struck at the foundation of American free institutions. Congress summoned him to Capitol Hill to defend his deportation raids.
At the end of it, Palmer is very frustrated. He saw the country call on him, demand him to take this hard line, and he did what he thought was his responsibility with the information he had before him. The hard part, though, is figuring out how you come up with something that addresses the threat, that doesn't at the same time do the collateral damage of sweeping up innocent people who've done nothing to deserve it.
Palmer still hoped he had enough support to win his party's presidential nomination. But when he arrived in San Francisco to appear before the delegates in July 1920, even his close friends regarded him as poor presidential material. The press wrote off the nation's fighting Quaker as the quaking fighter. By the time Palmer left the convention in defeat, hysteria-weary Americans were embracing the Republican nominee, Warren Harding. His campaign dismissed the radical threat and promised to return America to normalcy. On September 16, 1920, the stock market was having a bullish day. Reason for optimism after a bumpy summer. Inside the Morgan Bank, a partner was wrapping up a meeting with the owner of one of the country's largest mining operations about the latest round of strikes in the Pennsylvania coal fields. Across the street, government workers were busy transferring $1 billion in gold to the U.S. Subtreasury. A few minutes before noon, as lunchtime crowds began to fill Wall Street, a postal worker discovered 5 flyers stuffed inside a mailbox, just a short walk from the bank. As the bells of Trinity Church began to toll, he read the alarming words. Moments later, a violent blast rocked the financial district. It began with a flash, then a roar, followed by a force so powerful that skyscrapers 3 blocks north trembled from the impact. Fire-packed air smashed against buildings and burned through the lunch crowd, leaving devastation in its wake.
There's pandemonium everywhere. The brokers on the stock exchange think the glass dome atop the exchange is going to collapse. Trinity Church is shaken to its foundations. It's a terrifying scene.
When people came out from the trading floor, they could still see a mushroom cloud rising above Wall Street. It was hundreds of pounds of dynamite packed into a horse cart. When it went off, it just tore people in half.
Bodies mangled beyond description sprawled amidst the shattered glass. The remains of one man lay in front of the Morgan Bank. The building's pale granite walls stained with splotches of red.
All through the district were these little pieces of metal that were window weights, and they had been packed around the explosives. Many people died from lung injuries, from internal bleeding, as these weights penetrated their internal organs.
Most of the dead were under the age of 30 and made a modest living serving the trading houses of Wall Street.
If you set a bomb at the corner of Wall and Broad Streets, the assumption was you were aiming for the biggest men of American capitalism, but that's not who this bombing hit at all. It really impacted ordinary people.
As news of the tragedy spread, stock exchanges across the country suspended business. Eager to minimize further damage to the nation's financial markets, Wall Street leaders moved quickly to reopen the New York Exchange for business the next day. Crews worked feverishly throughout the night to clean up the shattered glass and hose down the blood-stained streets.
Wall Street's answer to the bombing is to get back to what they described as business as usual and to put on a real show of defiance and strength.
Trading resumed at the New York Stock Exchange the next morning, as 100,000 people descended on the financial district to view the effects of the explosion. The mixed emotions of the day were on full display at noon, when a previously scheduled celebration of the signing of the Constitution began its patriotic exercises. They gathered at the spot where George Washington first took the oath of office, his unscathed statue just steps from the epicenter of the blast. The solemn crowd listened to a prayer for national safety and a speech calling for the capture and killing of the bombers, then joined together to sing a rousing rendition of the national anthem. Attorney General Palmer was quick to point out that he might have been able to prevent the attack if Congress hadn't slashed his budget in the backlash against his raids. He called for a new deportation campaign and vowed to ram a peacetime sedition bill through Congress.
On the day after the bombing, Palmer stood there. He said, "I warned you that something like this was going to happen, and here it is. We need more raids. We need more aggressive action against the people who clearly did this."
Palmer found wide support for his ideas in national business publications. But other voices were more cautious. By what means are we to face attempts to overthrow the established order by deeds of violence? One newspaper asked. There must be no yielding to fear.
A lot of people stepped up in that moment and said, "We'll get the person who set off the bomb on Wall Street. We will try them in court and we will send them to prison. But we don't need to go after entire groups of innocent people just because they share certain political opinions."
Finding the person who set off the bomb proved difficult. After sifting through tons of debris, investigators confirmed the bomb had been planted on a horse-drawn cart, but they were unable to identify the driver. With the followers of Luigi Galleani considered prime suspects, agents scoured Italian neighborhoods for leads. They traveled to Italy to track down the deported Galleani himself. Like many other suspected conspirators, he was nowhere to be found. Never entirely convinced the Bureau was on the right track, Hoover secretly sent agents to Russia to find proof that Lenin's communists had directed the attack. After 3 years, officials had little to show for their efforts, but an embarrassing string of false arrests. The trail had gone cold.
Probably the best theory that we have suggests that the bomb was actually set by a man named Mario Buda, who was, in fact, an Italian anarchist who moved in the circle around Luigi Galleani. And Buda's act was a protest against the arrests and deportations of Italian radicals as a whole.
Buda disappeared. He later turned up in Italy. People went and talked to him, et cetera. He never admitted anything like this. But again, you never know who to believe when you're talking to anarchists.
As anniversaries of the Wall Street bombing came and went, fewer Americans seemed to notice the case had not been solved.
It is the Roaring '20s. It is a time of triumphal celebration of Wall Street as an icon of American success and prosperity. And somehow this bombing just seems very quickly like the last gasp of an older, much more conflict-ridden age.
The Wall Street bombing is the culminating point of a long period of anti-capitalism that engaged American culture and politics and economic life for well more than half a century. But the bombing put an end to that. This act of terrorism was, rather than a kind of reveille for radicals, it was kind of their final last gasp.
By 1924, A. Mitchell Palmer, the man who had led the war against radicals in America, was no longer a political force. But his sweeping deportation campaigns had achieved many of their aims.
The heavy-handed tactics of the officials had really just scared the hell out of anyone who thought of joining the movement.
The Communist Party goes underground. The anarchist community never again has the kind of presence in American politics and culture that it did in the teens.
J. Edgar Hoover did his best to distance himself from the deportation raids. He claimed Palmer alone had been calling the shots. Hoover relied on his reputation as an invaluable manager to win a series of promotions, becoming the director of the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation in 1924. he never lost his conviction that a violent left-wing conspiracy threatened the stability of the United States.
The Red Scare years remain really important to Hoover for the rest of his career. A lot of what he learns in those years he holds on to ideologically, but also strategically as well. If you're going to keep your files, if you're going to go after people, you want to kind of keep that quite close to the vest.
All the while he was promoting the Bureau as a modern crime-fighting organization, Hoover never stopped investigating people for their political ideas. He continued to add information to the secret files he created at the Radical Division, laying the groundwork for the agency's espionage efforts in the decades to come.
No case ever ends for the Federal Bureau of Investigation until it is solved and closed with the conviction of the guilty or the acquittal of the innocent.
Hoover was never able to convict anyone for the Wall Street bombing. The Bureau's last active investigation into the case was in 1944. The Wall Street bombing remains unsolved.